Hey everybody, welcome to an episode of the Rapcast, Raptors Weekly Podcast slash whatever this is. It's always kind of up and down. We don't really know what we're going to be talking about on a day-to-day basis. This one in the dregs of the off season, an interesting conversation today. Let me get out ahead of this. This is very insular. This borders on navel gazing. I'm here with my friend Adam, who I sit next to on Media Row to cover Raptors games. He covers a lot more than the Raptors, unlike myself. And we wanted to talk about, specifically Adam wanted to talk about with me, what media is like today. And so if you're just here for the basketball, feel free to just tune out. This is your forewarning. We're going to be talking about the media coverage of basketball, maybe some basketball stuff in it. Before I was doing media, this is a conversation I think I would have listened to if Blake and Eric were having it, or, one of the podcasts that I was interested at the time. So I'm hoping that, I guess, if there's an audience for that kind of stuff now, this is the podcast, especially since there's been so much tension between media and fans, especially as media are more accessible now, the same way that players are. And especially since media are asked to proliferate their brand on social media a lot more, and i.e., or by extension, get a lot more attention, all that kind of stuff. Adam, how the hell are you?
I'm doing great, Samson. Thanks for having me. Thanks for helping me live out my dream, hopping on the Rapcast after bugging you for probably 12 months or so. So appreciate you having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, we're great friends. We talk a lot. Anytime we leave the house, we end up running into each other, either going to a concert or going to, wherever, church in Wellesley, something like that. And I'll tell you this much. Adam and I, we crack more jokes than any media members out there. I bet my life on it.
I think you'd be right up there in the joke cracking rankings, but I think it's just an enjoyment of what we get a chance to do, and it's a long basketball season, and not that it's not fun to watch basketball for a living, but at the same time it's just important to make sure that you're having a good time while doing it, because at sometimes the NBA season and the Raptors in particular haven't always been so much fun to watch.
Yeah. This is the first thing I want to talk about is kind of where media is at currently. And so NBA players, the NBA in particular, is massive on social media. Players also have these big social presences. Scotty Barnes with the Raptors, for example, is a Twitch streamer. You go back like to 20, even something like 2018, before the Twitch boom during the pandemic, that would have been really, really odd for a player to do. But Scotty is accessible for hours during some days when he's streaming. A lot of players have these massive presences on social media where they, do brand deals and where they post. And maybe Kevin Durant is the best example of a guy showing as much of his personality as he can in the limited scope he's willing to show to fans by debating with them, arguing with them, having a laugh with them. And this trickles down to a bunch of different interactions between fan and player. This is, the media has been the medium between those two things. I'm curious, with NBA players going directly through their own agencies, their own companies, straight to the consumer, the fans, what do you think the relationship is now between the media, the players, and the fans?
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting dynamic, right? Because I think you mentioned two players who I already had circled on, and just as guys who uh, definitely make themselves known in a sense, and I think Kevin Durant is going to be one of the most interesting players to ever look back on when we look at the sport of basketball. Just the way his career arc went, just the way his openness went, just the way how he kind of shifted the paradigm of basketball over the course of time. And it's always interesting, I think, when you get to a conversation, when you say, oh man, like, why is Kevin Durant spending so much time of his day on social media? And then you look, and I don't think Kevin Durant's ever really run into a situation where you've seen him in the NBA while we're healthy, where he hasn't been at the top of his game. So I think for some players like that, the all-time guys, sure, Durant's a guy who's riffing off on social media. Joel Embiid's another guy who's always sometimes present, making subtle jokes and jabs, and he's going to post a tweet about this or Ben Simmons, or coach is fired, whatever he wants to post about. But I think the guys who are at the top of their game, they realize that it doesn't really take away from anything they're doing on the basketball court. It's not like they're going to say, "Oh," it's not like Kevin Durant says, "Oh, I'm going to skip my gym session today because I got to post for a few hours." It's not like he's skipping out on practice and not working on his craft and those sorts of things. So um, I think it's a really intriguing relationship. Just because obviously the players that have been in the league for years and years, like the Durants and whatnot, um, they kind of know that anything they do is going to be monitored. And um, I think it's mostly been a pretty fun, positive development. Obviously, we've seen that players have sometimes not always made the smartest moves on social media, but I think it in terms of just the idea of it being good or bad for the game, I really enjoy it, and I think a lot of people really enjoy it. And um, it can be addicting at times, of course, and there's its downfalls. But I think just the idea of just like having these players so accessible, where you look and in years past, these players were kind of like mythical figures almost in a sense. I really generally enjoy when the players decide to put themselves out there, because it just gives you something to pay attention to all the time. And people might get a little bit tired of it, but I think overall I tend to really enjoy the players who love to throw themselves out there.
You mentioned these mythical figures. The media members used to be like they tell the story of the mythical figure and they have a huge impact on how, it's like what's the term? Hagiography, the making of saints, right? They have a huge impact on how players are perceived. That's why media members for a long time, especially, during the proliferation of the NBA, white media members talking about black players with white ownership, white coaches, and so a lot of players were vilified or their stories weren't told as compassionately as they need to be. You juxtapose this with players now. I think you can recognize this in the fact that some player podcasts aren't listened to as much as players might expect them to be. And that players going directly to social media is also met with like, is that true? And players are not reliable storytellers for their own story either. Very few people are. That's why, the autobiography versus the biography is a thing. I'm curious where you think media sits in the middle of that as an industry that has more attention now, more money in it now than it ever has, and people consume so much media. Where do you think we sit relative to players trying to tell their own stories and then, writers, talkers of any kind, having conversations with players, coaches, ownership, and then relaying that to, the fans in a different way than I guess the players would?
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting topic on sort of what the media's end goal is, and what they're trying to do, and how they go about doing it. I think the interesting thing that I always note in the way that things get picked up and broadcast to the world is pretty much every interaction with the media and a player, for the most part, outside of one-on-one interviews, is generally available somewhere for public consumption. But at the same time, most people don't spend their time sitting through going on YouTube and watching an entire press conference, right? Most people we know have, like myself included, have pretty short attention spans, and most people will just be scrolling through, and they're either looking for a headline, they're looking for a click, they're looking for a quote. So I think the biggest thing for media members, or for the people who have the hours in their day, like myself, and they're paid to do so, or in the sense of sometimes fans who are just really interested in that sort of thing, and they start growing their own platform. I think it's just the importance of that is just finding a way to present the information that's already out there in a fair manner. And at the end of the day, like the way I've always felt about it is, my opinions are what they are, but I think that I've always been more interested in just hearing whatever the person, the player or the coach that's making millions of dollars to do this on a daily basis, and that's what fans are paying to see, and most interested in. I'm always interested in just seeing whatever they say, and however you can contextualize that to present it to somebody who's just scrolling through their Twitter feed, or who's just scrolling through Google or Facebook, or whatever platform they're getting their news from, and just finding a way to just present that information in the fairest way possible, with the most context possible.
So I think we agree on that anytime somebody has, this is kind of what I go into a press conference looking for basically. Like For example, we had a lot of laughs this past year because you did a lot of the asking of opposing star players about Scotty Barnes because truthfully, there's a real appetite for that. People want to know how their young star is viewed through the lens of other star players in the NBA. You were going and asking a lot of the opposing stars, "Hey, what do you think about Scotty? How he's progressing, all this kind of stuff." And players repeatedly gave very good answers, had high expectations for Scotty. For myself, since I'm doing a lot of analysis writing of what's going on during the games, I go in knowing what the team did on the court, knowing that if I say it, it means something to some people, but not that much to other people. And so I want to ask questions wherein the player or the coach will say the same thing that I'm going to say because it's more meaningful. I'm curious what you think of that approach. Like, if
Yeah,
writing or asking questions to write to your story, I should say.
yeah. I mean, I think the way I always think about it is I try and, like when I stepped into the Raptors beat 2 years ago, I tried to learn kind of one, the different personalities of each beat writer, and two, just try to learn as much about like the Raptors media core as a whole, and what each person generally writes about, and sort of going through 41 or 41 pre and post game interviews every single game. You kind of get a sense of like what everybody is looking for, what's been asked already, what is stale, like I think especially in terms of a head coach, that's a relationship where you get to know them pretty well. And you don't have to ask about, I think in some cases, if the Raptors have, let's say, 4 home games over the span of 2 weeks, or something like that. If somebody asked about, oh, do you think Thad Young's getting back in the rotation this week, and the coach gives a good answer, you don't need to ask about that for another 2 weeks because you kind of already have your answer. So I think I just try and gain as much information as possible, and I try and see like what you can't infer that isn't hasn't already been asked. And I think, getting back to your question, I think it's just whenever you see a quote that's been like presented on social media for whatever reason it is, it could be a coach, gassing up a Raptors player. It could be a Raptors coach, maybe saying one of his own players needs to do a bit better. I think it's important to just try and understand, what the genesis of that question was, and I think that's sometimes where the disconnect comes, where you see, a coach saying, oh, this bench player could have been a bit better tonight, and people think it's super personal, but it's just the result of a direct question that's being asked by a reporter trying to gain information. And the same thing with when I was asking a bunch of players about Scotty Barnes, I was writing this article that was just like, here's how the NBA stars view Scotty Barnes. And it took the course over like 2 months to get all these questions in, and it was weird because if you're a Western Conference team, you visit the Raptors once a season, and I got a couple Western Conference players in there, and things like that. And when the Raptors are losing, people say, "Oh, why are you asking about this guy who's struggling, quote unquote?" And it's an interesting relationship to just try and gauge what each media members are doing and sort of their end result. And I think at the end of the day, most of the time it's just simply each individual media member is just trying to get something out of it, and it's usually just the end result of an article. But in the process, these quotes can come up in a way that it seems like there's maybe a further motive there that I think usually doesn't exist.
I think that's something I've seen people complain about in the past is that with the Raptors elsewhere, that during press conferences, especially not like big press conferences like Darko's introduction, where we're handed a mic and you get the question and you get the answer and you know the full context of it. But a lot of the times you can't actually hear, especially like I've listened to myself ask questions and I'm really bad at like talking for the mic. The coach can hear me or the player can hear me, but the mic can't really pick me up. So a lot of times players are answering questions that you don't really understand or know, and then that creates like this contextless discussion of it, which I think is I don't know if it's feasible to because scrums and like press conferences are just like everybody's talking and it's this communal effort to have a good conversation with the coach. It's not coach and media; it's just a bunch of people talking and trying to figure stuff out for the most part. But I don't know. That's interesting. I'm curious where you think like do you think that media currently does a good job of providing context and not sensationalizing things for social media.
I think it's an interesting balance because I think when you look at like just the average like day to day of a media member, you know, if you're, especially if you're, you know, one of the more senior members of the Raptors beat, they're generally like they have a million things going on a given day, right? Like you have, you know, you'll have the game day, like just on a game day, you'll probably have your game day, you'll have like two or three radio hits, you might have a TV hit, right? Like I just think, you know, for a given, yeah, just any given like big major media member, they're always doing a million things, and I think sometimes. I think where context is lost is when you know things are maybe paraphrased and not fully understood, just in the way that things get posted on you know Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days. And I think the most important thing that I always try and do is just use the longest quote possible. You know, whenever I put something out into the universe, I always try and you know see how many words I can get from a player, because I think that NBA players are really interesting. Where you have the you know, you have the OG Ananobis of the world who's been known for giving the one or two sentence answers. And then you have, you know, other players like Fred VanVleet who will talk for, you know, sometimes like 2.5 minutes on a given answer. And you're saying to yourself like, oh man, I got to get this post out into the world. And, you know, how do I contextualize this? And, you know, what do I say? So I think the way that I found that creates the least amount of friction or like room for, you know, room for lack of or room to be as clear as possible, is just to get as many words as the player possibly said into a quote. And yeah, I think it's always tough, right, when you see that, you know, the big accounts, you know, the aggregator accounts, the NBA essentials of the world, so to speak, and they're pulling from, you know, 30 different media markets and 30 different beat reporters.
Onfiredigital.com.
Yeah, and it's a tough one because you know sometimes you see a quote and then it goes out into the world and it's you know one sentence, and then you notice the second sentence is paraphrased, and then it says, oh, you know, there was a fight in the locker room, or there was you know this and that, and then you see the beat reporter coming in with a follow up. So I think the main way, you know, for anybody to try and contextualize it is, yeah, if you can, you know, if you see a quote that looks a little bit fishy, if you get a chance to actually check out the full availability. But at the same time, I know that, you know, not everybody has the time in the day to search out these things. And I think it is super important for reporters to just
I think
realize
they
that
I think they
some quotes.
do on the whole. I think reporters do a pretty bad job, and I think that's influenced by social media specifically. And I think that there's economic factors and social factors that push them towards doing a worse job of it, because there is, as far as for your, I don't know, your platform, an upside to being misunderstood constantly when you're tweeting out other people's words, I think, you know?
Yeah, and I
And
think the
yeah, it doesn't have to be malicious, I should say, but I think that as somebody who is like, and like I am a slut for context. I'm just always trying to like couch things, couch. I think there is. It's usually it's like the usual suspects who do it. I'm not talking about Toronto specifically, but as you said, like NBA Central or something. I think that there are people who repeatedly abuse that, and those types of people, it's a you know a self fulfilling prophecy or whatever. People who abuse those measures of journalism and do a bad job of it will actually get a lot of promotion online and a lot of engagement, and that will continue to push them further. And then that increased engagement will mean that that's a lot of what people are seeing. That's I think
yeah,
my thesis on it.
I think the other thing too is like when you just go back to the point of not being malicious. Um, like I think that for the most part, if you're an NBA journalist or just like any kind of sports journalist, I would say almost everybody that I've met, you know, in the industry, they do it because they really like enjoy their job. They really enjoy the sport of basketball. They enjoy what they do, and I think that you know, in some cases there are like relationships between players and media that can grow toxic. But I think generally people, you know, don't like want their space to be a negative one. And you know, you can talk about like the way that basketball gets covered on ESPN, for example, and sometimes there's larger you go on social media and there's the same three debates that are going on every day. Is this player the MVP? Is this player a ring chaser? Is this player going to get 17 rings in their NBA career, or whatever like that? But I think you said, like, I don't think a lot of people are malicious about it. I think it's just like the way that things ultimately end up getting presented sometimes can get the original messages lost along the way.
I think that I've only met a few in my time covering it, but beat reporters who you can tell there's not a lot of care for the way that they present info. They are hyper aware of what charts. They're hyper aware of what brings attention, and but I think that's a lot more common for the people who speak on the big places like ESPN, where it's like not even infotainment, but it's just entertainment. And those people are kind of egged on by producers, whereas like the journalist editor thing, you're not going to have somebody in your ear saying like, yeah, push this, strive for this. It's a lot more personal between, media, players, coaches, and all that kind of stuff. But I have met in my time some beat writers who are just like they want the, like, I don't know, salacious news to go out there, and they're very driven by that. I'm curious. Aggregation is kind of what I want to talk about because that's a big one. We see, I don't know, you get aggregated sometimes. I get aggregated sometimes. I'm behind a paywall, so less so. Sometimes people will aggregate the podcast. Um, in your mind, if you were to be aggregated, what are you hoping to see happen in a tweet?
Yeah, I think the most important thing about I think like Brian Windhorst is a guy who always seems to talk about aggregation and the issues with aggregation, and part of my job as well is just finding a way to in some ways aggregate news. I think, like, when you look at especially around things like trade rumors, draft rumors, signing rumors, like those sorts of things are things which sometimes get just embedded in larger articles by people that are more in the know than myself. I've never really had too many scoops in my career of any kind, but at the same time, there's sometimes there's things that are buried in larger pieces by league-wide beat writers that would say, oh, the Raptors made this trade offer, or the Raptors are interested in signing this guy. And again, I think with aggregation, the most important thing to do is just make sure that you hope that it's truthful. And I think that's the way that I've always seen it is, if you're putting a quote into the world, you never want to be the person who has to say, "Oh, I didn't mean it like this," or I didn't mean it like that." I think if you're able to, I try to. For a while, I was always trying to include videos in my tweets, just because I think that's a way where you can say, "Oh, like, here's the direct impact," and I realize that sometimes that doesn't always matter as much, but I think as long as you just put as many of the quotes from a direct person that um, limits the issues with aggregation. So I think aggregation is sometimes used as like a dirty word in a sense, where people are saying, like, oh, why would this be aggregated, and why would that be aggregated? And like I said, going back to Windhorst, he's a guy who's, you can tell, is careful with his words and the way that he speaks, because he knows that people care about everything that he says, and that happens with a lot of the biggest reporters in our sport. But yeah, I think it's the nature of the sport, is people are constantly craving news, and they're constantly craving rumors and that sort of thing. And I think just when you're doing aggregation for whatever style of writing or reporting you're doing, it's just important to be yeah, as fair and accurate as possible.
I think the big thing is that what what are the means by which you are held accountable? You know, if you're, say, a reporter, you have a public persona, profile, whatever, and if you continuously upset players and fans because you're bad at relaying news, because that's the first step, right? Is like media takes what players say and they contextualize, they write stories, they report on it, all this kind of stuff. And those relationships, it's very important for those to, do better, that you get those right. And in some cases, they care a lot less that you get it right. Fans, it's cannon fodder a lot of the time. They just want something to talk about and react to. But players, since you're talking about them, it's very important that you get it right. And you and I have seen people who get different responses from different athletes, people get different responses from different coaches because of how they've behaved in the past. So there's a cause and effect there. For aggregators who exist mostly online, I don't think anything holds them to an ideal. I don't think anything holds them to reporting something truthfully, and it's another step down the game of telephone, so it becomes tougher to maintain the initial message. And so it's extremely important that reporters and journalists take it extremely seriously to provide like the most context, the most truthful presentation of what's being said, and that when you are, and to not editorialize, but instead to separate your opinion from what's being said. And I think a lot of the time that gets conflated, and especially from aggregators. And so it's not inherently a bad thing. Some people, I think, can aggregate in good faith and can do a decent job of kind of like diluting the information and presenting it holistically as it was kind of as it was intended to be received or put out. But I think that like most things, if you expect just people in general to do a good job in relaying information, the farther it gets away from the source, the less likely it is to be true. And the aggregation assembly line, because now we see it go down like 3 or 4 levels. Like it could be a guy says it, and then Brian Windhorst says it, and then NBA Central says it, and they don't aggregate properly, and then someone else says it. And I think there was like a Reddit post that said how people don't understand basketball is that Bill Simmons watches like 10 games of a guy a year, but mostly highlight packages. And then he talks about basically a player he's only seen through highlight packages. And then there's a guy who's listening who has watched one game, but listens to Bill Simmons' opinion of highlight packages. And then that guy tells people who haven't watched a single game. And then that's mostly the opinion of a player, is people who haven't actually seen a guy play. The farther you get away from it, the tougher it is. And that's, I think, my qualm with aggregation, because I don't think most people do it very well, unfortunately. But I guess the one thing I want to know, what do you want to see in a tweet? Like if somebody aggregates you, what do you hope to see in the tweet?
Yeah, I think in terms of just being aggregated, a lot of the time I think it also depends on just different mediums as well, because like you said in a tweet, but sometimes I find a lot of the time there's accounts on Instagram, or usually it's Instagram where you see sort of the lasting impact of something, because I think on Twitter things can die out like within the course of a day or so, and on Instagram just the way the algorithms work is it's just an app where people sometimes see things later. And I think one, people always like to be credited. I think after a while you kind of stop caring about that. If you sometimes you see your things credited, sometimes they're not credited. You can tell where they come from, and sometimes you get tagged, and I kind of gave up on really caring at all about that, because it's like it's this person, unless if it's a big brand account and they're like making money off of it, then they should probably credit things properly. But I think yeah, at the end of the day, it's all about just trying to just present facts in a truthful manner. I feel like I'm beating a drum here in some sense, but I think you want. I think for me, the way I've always felt about it, it's a quote that my mom told me. So she worked in the media industry for many years, recently retired. But she said, like, if you're ever putting somebody in the news, whether it's somebody that's famous, or whether it's somebody that's just going to be in the news once, and especially for the people who are just going to be in the news once, like you kind of owe it to them to give it your best and most accurate interpretation of the events. And you deserve to, like, if you're putting your information out there in the world, it's important to not rush through these kinds of things. And it could be for a player. Like one player I think about all the time is like Justin Champagny. He had his short-ish stint in Toronto, all things considered. And I remember he had this one press conference where he had a pretty decent game, and I believe they were playing Oklahoma City, and he just missed a
Yeah.
possible buzzer beater at the end of the game.
I worked that game actually.
And he came into the press conference room afterwards, and he was super hyped up, and they lost the game. But I remember I was kind of thinking like, oh, this is a pretty big moment in his like NBA career. He kind of had like the most run he'd ever had. I wrote about him and a couple other people wrote about him, and that was kind of like the highlight of his time with the Raptors, which was weird. But I think just anytime you're, star players are going to have their moments in their days and all that. But for the guys that are just trying to crack the league or is just, on the 2-way contracts and are fighting for roster spots, like it's still very real to them. And I think it's just important to just present the information in a way that, you realize that, sure, maybe for a guy that's already making $100+ million, might not be the be all end all for them, but for the guys that are further down, the bench players, the guys that are still fighting for the next contract, it really does matter how you do present them to the world, and even if they are professional athletes and are making more money than you or I, it doesn't mean that they still don't have a vested interest in the way that they're shown to the world.
I'm curious, and show it to your mom. That's a great humanistic approach to it. Is applying an extra level of care is never going to hurt you in a situation. I find anyway, and obviously she finds that as well. What do you think is the best approach to be mindful of a player's celebrity status and to like, hey, there's 18 people sitting here and you're the one in front of the microphone, and to approach it that way? Or do you think it's generally healthier to say human, human conversation?
Yeah, I think I've always, I think a lot of people when they kind of step into that NBA or whatever league media room and for the first time, it's like a little bit intimidating because you probably recognize a couple other media members that have been there for a while. They're on TV and the things like that, and then you walk in and you see players and you go, wow, like that guy's real tall, and you say, yeah, but after a while, I think you realize that like it's not that tough to have a conversation with these sorts of people. Sure, you might get a little nervous asking your first couple questions, and you might fumble up on your words a little bit, but you realize that everybody else in the media room is in the same boat, right? Like they're um, everybody's gone through their training or different levels of writing to get to that point, and I think it's the same thing with players, right? Like you realize that, yeah, sure, there's a player who might be making a supermax deal, or they may be on 15 all-star teams or anything like that, but it's important to try and just find a way to crack them in the sense where you can just get something that really provokes their thought. And I think that's like one of my favorite things to do when you're in a press conference, is to like really have that moment where you think you can realize the player is actually, thinking about your question and not just giving you a generic answer. I think they probably, people ask me sometimes like what my favorite moment was, like in a press conference. And I think so far for me, it was probably, it was a conversation I had with Durant. It was just talking about Christian Coloco, who, was wearing number 35. And he said, Durant was his favorite player growing up. And, part of me thought maybe he'd heard that just because it's a thing in Toronto you'd heard, and Kevin Durant's like the most online guy in the world, and I relayed this info to him, and I was like, hey Kevin, like Christian Coloco, where's your number? And like he really stopped about it and thought about it for a second, and he smiled, and this was a moment that like had kind of went out there, and it made it onto like the official NBA account and all that. So but I think you can tell that even these players that have been Hall of Fame bound superstar players, they still have these moments where maybe they don't love doing all the media stuff, but they still try and I'd say for the most part they try and give it an honest answer when they're asked questions that kind of provoke thoughts within them. So yeah, I think it's important just to like treat these people like humans, see what you can get out of them, and that sometimes your questions hit and you get an amazing answer, and sometimes your question doesn't quite hit, and you kind of have to figure out if exactly what you're going to get out of that press conference. But yeah, after a while, I think you just realize to treat these people like humans, and just kind of understand the journey that they've got on to get to whatever point in their career they're at.
Yeah, I think it's a lot harder for an NBA player to view it the other way. Like the NBA players understand that we're humans on the other side of it, but we're all like, if you were an NBA player, why wouldn't you view media as like, ugh, like just a bunch of people trying to get you to say something, and a lot of the like players don't read the gamers, they don't read the stuff, they typically only read the big stuff they see, maybe even aggregated online, right? And so when most of your interactions with media, the things you say kind of dissipate into nothingness, you never keep track of them going forward. Only when it turns out bad and you're facing this room full of people who like it can only really go bad or okay for you, it would be hard to be like, okay, just human to human, we're just having a conversation. And I think some players get there, but I understand why a lot of players don't. But from our point of view, I think the just like we're on equal footing. I know you're a millionaire. I know everyone's here to see you, but just a couple people talking is the best approach. I'm kind of curious, since you started, you take in a ton of media about a bunch of different sports. You've been like you're a fan of so many things. We've talked about this, off the pod, of course, but kind of looking at the coverage of the NBA from when you first started watching it to now, what do you think has changed?
Um, yeah, I think the way I think about it sometimes is like I think most people, when you get a little bit older into your teen years, you start to like grasp pro sports as a whole a little bit more. Like I grew up in Toronto and, kind of like watched the Raptors through the mid 2000s, but I was never, it was hard to cheer for those teams in a sense because they were just, they weren't the best teams. And then, you get a little bit older and, you're following the league as a whole. And I think so much of, seeing the coverage around LeBron in particular and just, the decision and kind of his time in Miami and things like that. I remember there was a moment where I was just kind of told that you're not supposed to like LeBron James because he made a decision to go to a different team, and then I remember there was a moment when I was watching the finals in 2012, and I'd kind of told myself for a couple of years, oh, I don't really like LeBron, and I don't really like this super team, and things like that. And I was watching him and I was like, this is the best athlete I've ever seen in my life. And I was kind of like, I don't know why we're not supposed to, celebrate this and enjoy this. And I think, kind of that moment, I realized that, like I always kind of tell people, like, I don't really dislike any NBA players for the most part. Like almost entirely. There's certain players that you can get annoying for certain off court reasons, or kind of play like weird styles, and there's the pests in the league and the and things like that. But like from just like a general idea, I try to just enjoy just about as much basketball in the purest form as I can, and I think one thing that I think people have realized is just when it comes to LeBron that sometimes those debates about is he a good player, is he a good ambassador for the game, is he a good scorer, which obviously he's proven all these things over time. I think we've seen that sometimes people realize like this forced toxicity is kind of silly. I think Russell Westbrook is another player where people have seen over time that hating on him became like the fun normal thing to do, and then people kind of backed off a bit when they realized like, hey, maybe he's not the reason for all of the Los Angeles Lakers problems over time. So I think I like to see when people just like really recognize the human side of players. Especially the ones that have not been able to get to whatever goal they're reaching for. I think like you look at a guy like Nikola Jokic, and I've always found him just like easy to kind of support his story. The same thing with Giannis before him, where it was like, oh, great individual player. People always want to see him perform in the playoffs. Is he going to be able to perform in the playoffs? And
Do you think
it's
that's
nice when
more
the
present now in media than it was back then?
um, I think it's always a tough thing, right? Because we did have that like several year stretch of people would just call the NBA boring because of the way the finals matchups seem to be recurring every year between Cleveland and Golden State, and I think the way that the league has gone into five different champions in 5 years has kind of helped in some sense create different players that are easy to root for as they try and get their way up the ladder, but at the same time. I don't know. It's a tough one to answer because I think people also do generally enjoy hating on players, and I kind of think I got past that stage after a while because I realized like, hey, you don't have to say you're a fan of all 30 teams or anything like that, but you can also just appreciate that ranking players endlessly isn't necessarily just going to be the best way to enjoy the game.
Do you think that hmm, I guess do you think that the racial aspect of the league has gotten better over time? And do you think that social media is responsible for that in any way?
Um, yeah, I think it's a interesting one because you can see the way that certain players get covered, right? And you look at like Pascal Siakam's a guy in Toronto, where you kind of there's just like a guy who's coming to the NBA and what didn't grow up in North America and obviously grew up in Cameroon and came into the game later in life and just received so much like intense criticism for his struggles throughout the 2020 NBA playoffs and there was a lot of racist things levied towards him and you see a lot of talk a lot when it comes to contracts and things like that, where people say like, "Oh, these players don't deserve that," and when you talk about that sort of thing. So I think it is. I think society as a whole, it seems like it does inch closer towards getting better, and then you sometimes you spend a lot of time online and you're saying like, "Oh man, this is still a really really toxic environment," and you wonder. You know, if the media and everybody's presenting, a heavily black league in a fair manner. So I think that's just an important thing when you're conscious of the way you're talking about players and about their stories and what does this player deserve and what does this player you know uh, what's their place in the NBA and things like that. I think it's super important for like people like you and I as white media members to just just be aware of the history of the league, history of the game, history of the sport, and all that, and just kind of understand how important it is to be just like conscious of the moment.
I do find it interesting because you had with I think the NBA obviously over the past 15 years has expanded as far as like the fandom of it, the amount of money it makes, everything is just way, way bigger. Even the salary cap, you look at 10 years ago, the salary cap, I believe, was like 58 million. This year it's about to be 134 million. And that means that that's an expression of every team 30 times over, and that's 50% of the CBA. Like there's just way more money there. And when you get money and when you get analytics, you get players talked about in number form, dollars, impact, etc. You get that, and I think that's dehumanizing, and I think that that puts players in like a negative light, and it skews towards a more like ownership friendly view of the league. But then also I think over the past like 10 years as a fan and then a media member, I've observed the fandom come more towards pro player, pro labor, and so leaning on the side of like player, player, player instead of leaning on the side of team, team, team. And so, like, I think that's the proper place to sit the power dynamic. But I think that's also something that's changed where for years and years and years, and media was definitely complicit in this, players were positioned as dissidents nonstop all the time, even in an era where there was nothing close to player empowerment. But if a player ever got out of line, God forbid anything, like it was never about what the ownership did, it was never about the coach, it was like players acting out for years and years and years. You could even see that with the decision and LeBron, the coverage of it. It's seen differently now. And player empowerment is obviously the agency the players have and the liberties they take to kind of direct their own traffic is way different than what it was. But I think on the whole, just a player saying like, hey, I'd like to live here, I want to work here, this is what I want to do. And the ideals of the player being in opposition to the ideals of the team are viewed more friendly by fans and media now than they were even just say like 10 years ago. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of like another moment when you talk about the player owner dynamic, because I think that people talk about the NBA as being a star driven league, and I think that's like sometimes people talk about it in like a negative sense, and I always found that really strange because it's basketball is a sport where your stars are going to control so much of the game, and as much as people love to celebrate the role players and the guys who come up big and clutch playoff moments and get remembered forever because of it, it's your best teams are where they are because of their stars. And one moment that I thought got a really weird amount of coverage this year was the incident in the playoffs between the Nuggets and Suns, where Jokic and Matt Ishbia were fighting for a basketball on the sidelines, and for like, it was, I don't know, 2 or 3 days after, before the next game, there was all this talk about, should Jokic be suspended, should um, what's this hold, and then people were like praising Matt Ishbia for like being the nicest guy in the world, for saying like, oh, Jokic shouldn't be suspended. And I remember I was just thinking about this, and I was like, one, I've heard Matt Ishbia's name quite a bit for a guy who's owned a basketball team for about 2 months, or whatever it was at that time. And this is a guy who, again, has seems to find his way in every Phoenix Suns story I've read in the past 4 months. And two, it was strange because I remember both Jokic and Michael Malone were asked about it after the game, and they were kind of like, I don't know who that guy was, right? Like, as even though you're a billionaire, and you're on ESPN and all that, like, you shouldn't really care about Matt Ishbia all that much, right? Like, it's interesting when ownership changes hands, and it's interesting to see how transactions are done, and it's clear that the Suns have thrown a bunch at trying to win now with the way things are done. But at the end of the day, as much as we like talking about transactions and off court stuff and all that, like, it's a star driven league, and I think that players should generally be behind these guys that have dedicated their life to the sport of basketball. And Matt Ishbia, all respect to his Michigan State career, and whatever basketball he played before that. He's an NBA owner because he worked in the mortgage industry for years and years and years. And I think it's like, nobody's a fan of mortgages, right? Like, you're a fan of basketball, and so I think just generally, even if you were to say like, oh, I support the players in 100% of their CBA fights, and battles against the owners and things like that, like, I think you'd come out looking like a, I don't know when I say it's like a moral battle, but yeah, in the sense of just like, I think you
I
should be
think it's a
supporting the
moral
players.
battle for what
Yeah,
it's worth.
I think just ethically, like, I think if you just want to say, oh, these are the guys that I pay to watch, these are the guys that are putting up the highlights that fund this league, and things like that. I think it's okay to just be like, yeah, we want our players to get paid, and I think coaches too. I think a lot of coaches, they talk about, they're like, these are my guys, right? Like, you only have 15, 17 guys on a roster, and you spend a lot of time with them, and as much as coaches like to work in conjunction with management, they like to see it's not always quite a friendship, but just like that strong working relationship. And I think it's okay to just like understand, like, hey, the salary cap is what it is, but at the same time, it's cool to see guys that you like get paid. And I think sometimes fans, sometimes say they see a number and they go, oh, like, that's too much. And it's, I don't know if there's any stopping it anytime soon. I don't think I'm going to convince anybody to feel otherwise, but I wish sometimes there was just a bit more appreciation of, where you get from the start of your career to where you get to get that, major max salary, or multi-year contract, or whatever it is that you're making, a ton of money at the end of the day.
Sure. So the last thing I want to talk about is the kind of the future of coverage. And so I'll present it like this. There are more people writing about the NBA now by far than there was in 2008, let's say. Zach Lowe famously got hired by ESPN in the wake of, or prior to the decision to help cover that, because they were expecting, like, oh, with the decision, it clearly signals how much more people care about not only the NBA but the transaction side of things. Just like the NBA as a whole, you can cover it in the off season. There's a lot more people who are trying to read stuff. There's a lot more people who are trying to listen to stuff. So the industry is now like chock full of people writing, talking, videos, TikToks, whatever it is, short form, long form. And the majority of those people now, whereas like prior to it, if you were a sports writer or a sports journalist, you would be probably close to like the median wage in a given country or something like that. Now the majority of writers would, if they do it full time, you'd be below the poverty line. And so the industry is making just hand over fist a ton of money, but there's more people for that money to go to. And it's not something that is a viable career for many people who do it. And since everything's moved online, the internet has been historically extremely poor at paying people for what they produce. It has resulted in truly like late capitalist haves and have nots, 99%, 1%, etc. With that said, what do you think the future of the industry is with players more confidently providing their own look into themselves, not necessarily doing it through media, with less money in media, and like it's important for there to be that middle ground where people hold people accountable and look for different things and provide perspective from like a working class person who covers these players. I'm curious where you think the future of the industry is going while looking at the monetary trends and coverage trends.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily a positive one, to say the least. I think it's an interesting one too because I think when you look around just the media room when you're at Scotiabank Arena or whatever arena that a media member is in, most of these people are kind of like lifers in their industry. There's people that come and go, but it's not like there's too many job openings every so often, right? Like there's only even for the biggest networks, right? Like people, um, it's rare that people just leave the industry at some point, and you hope that people that have found a way to kind of ground themselves in it as long as they're able to withstand the long hours and the burnout and all the stress that comes with it with the job sometimes. I think you look at certain individuals and it's always kind of a gamble for or not necessarily a gamble, but it's a business decision for whatever network that or employer that they're supported for to say, okay, are we keeping this given person with us, and how long are we keeping them for? And you hope as a media member that your employer is saying, this is a good person to keep around. So I think in one sense it's always about like individuals because I think it's so much harder to not that there's not people that are willing to do the job because there's so many people that are willing. I think it's always this balance of major funding source, whether it's a telecom, right? It's a Bell or a Rogers, or any of their major media supporters, and it's just always a balance of trying to figure out for these giants if they want to pay people money. And I think that it's weird in the sense of where you look at where the funding comes from because so much of it has come from like digital advertising, which, like you said, is not a great source of ways to pay people. And I think there's you know we've seen that the subscription model is obviously something that you employ and other websites employ, but people just famously also say like, why would I pay for sports coverage? I can get it for free. So I think it's super important just for the people that are in the industry to um, just give it their most honest shot and just understand the scarcity of jobs in the industry while also just like being it's hard because I don't think anybody wants to hear journalists complain about they're underpaid, as much as it pains me to say that sometimes because people would say like, oh, I would take your job tomorrow. And I think the future of the industry is like you said, not the brightest, and it's just this like awful grind sometimes where you say like, oh, I love what I do, and I think I'm super fortunate personally, but I think for so many people that are getting into it, it's a tough one because there's only so many like, not that there's not enough physical space, but there's only so many employers in the world that are actually paying a living wage. And I think it's just important for the people who do work in this industry to just kind of speak out about their experiences and speak out on behalf of the people that aren't able to stick it out in this field, because they need to just like live and support their families and support their livelihoods and pay rent in the city of Toronto or whatever major city they're in. So as somebody who's like been able to make it work, I know that it's not something that always would have been available to everyone, and I think it's important to just like talk about that and appreciate that, and fight for anybody who is trying to make it in the industry.
I think it's more than anything a monetization problem because the people who the places that do provide a living wage typically pay less, like basically like any employer, right? Most big corporations are making a ton of money and like are focused more on profit than they are on supporting their employees. But it's that's why I think it's important to highlight that like more people take in NBA content, written work, video, whatever, than ever before. And people are paid less, like way, way less on average. And it's because nobody really knows how to monetize the internet properly. So my worry is that if you go to like YouTube or something, the commentary community on YouTube, not necessarily video essay, but reactionary commentary stuff, is very big. There's a lot of people who get a lot of views. There's smaller channels that when they do commentary on something that is of particular interest, their views will skyrocket. And then so it's like this ultimate, just like the invisible hand of the free market, talk about the stuff that are like the deepest interests of humanity, and then that's what drives. And so it's just like people's vapid, like very quick, gimme, the way they want to get like news is what will be reflected in the news that they are given. And so that's what I worry about. And so like commentary is just like it's less so about the person who's doing it and more so about what they're commenting on. And that means that you are definitely like a slave to how you position and present the commentary, in how it's received, in how many people view it. And then also it means that you have to continuously attach yourself to different things to try and maintain up with what people want. And that means that you can't really carve your own lane. That means that you can't come to understand something extremely well because you've worked with it for a long time, because you have to move with the trends of what people want commentary on. And what happens in the YouTube commentary space is that basically it's haves and have nots. It's a sea of people producing. Then a very small percentage of those people have a lot of money because the views and all that kind of stuff centralizes there. They can do merchandise, they can do Patreon and all that kind of stuff. And I think that is the natural flow of how people consume online. And I think that like media, if people want it to be protected in any way, you have to probably end up paying for it, because people still don't know how to monetize the internet, and that's expensive. I pay for like 7 different people's patrons who do sports coverage. Like that's expensive, but I know that it's important that I pay for those people so that they get a chance to do it. And like it's expensive for me. It doesn't end my life though, and it's trying to battle turning into like YouTube commentary, because I think that's the way that everything pushes, is like if you don't protect industries, they will become gig economied. Like they will just completely be flattened into that completely and totally. And I think that's very bad for everyone down the line. But I don't know. Labor protections are important. You can try and do it yourself, but yeah, I don't know what it's going to look like for the NBA, or for basketball media coverage. But I do think if there's an intervention and like a curiosity and a want to protect it, and whether consumers want that or not, they don't have to want that. The people in the industry definitely do. Um, there has to be like intervention of some sort to try and protect what it is, and that it doesn't just become like a CPM type of I guess industry where it's like some people get millions of views and make like $120,000 a year, and then some people get hundreds of thousands of views and make 20,000, and then other people just you would never ever make any substantial amount of money. It's interesting, you know.
Yeah, I think what I've learned is we need more Mr. Beasts in the NBA content sphere. I would I'm curious. Like it is always interesting. I find just like the ways of how different people get access to to their big platforms, because there are some I think like every year you kind of see around like the NBA finals and NBA playoffs and things like that where you do see more like content creators, so to speak, influencers or whatever you want to refer to people as is kind of getting access to players and things like that. And I think it's just important for networks to learn and adapt and just yeah, like you said, like reward the people that are good at what they do, and recognize the need for just like diversity of content and diversity of voices, because like it goes back to what we were saying earlier about just like trying to learn about everybody's different space in the Raptors media scene, because I think you can have 15 different people that are watching the same game and working on 15 different pieces of content. Whether you might be writing about Jakob Poeltl's footwork or something, and then
Yeah.
and then there's a story about then there could be a story about Scotty Barnes as a high school friend at the game, and then you have a different story about something, and there's always like so much to talk about and so much to work on, and I think it's important that I think if there's any major media executives listening to this to realize that there's value in content that isn't always just the direct result of an ad dollar, because I think it just brings a good a feel to the platform, whatever platform you're on, and I think I hope that that all the people the good people that I've come to know through my few years as a full-time media member will be able to support themselves and support their dreams and livelihoods and things like that. So I think it's never a bad thing when there's investment in media. I just hope that it's done with a way that recognizes the people who are involved in it.
It's interesting, and yeah, it seems like it's trending the way that many other things are trending. um and it isn't the last bastion of like labor. Don't get me wrong. There are more important things to do out there than what Adam and I do, and as he stated, like, man, there are people who would, I don't know if they'd be like impressed with the wage, probably not, but they'd be like, that sounds like a cool job, I'd like to do that. um the tough part of getting into this industry is, of course, that there is very little labor protection. It is, like you do an internship in a lot of cases, you do free labor, or you do like pennies on the dollar labor. You just have to grind it out until you get a platform where maybe then you end up getting a living wage somewhere. All of this benefits the consumer immensely because you just get like a sea of content. And but it's the way many things are. You could look at fast fashion, you could look at a ton of industries that things that are beneficial for the consumer are typically not as beneficial for the workforce. And yeah, I hope that there's a happy medium found. And I also hope that, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, writers, talkers, those who are employed with living wages, those who aren't, do their best to tell honest stories of the men and women that they cover in sports and in the WNBA or the NBA, and they try and honor people's stories better than they have been. And not to say that, the media is bad, not to say that all that kind of stuff, but certainly the media can strive to do better. And especially since consumers are driving media towards more vapid and superficial coverage, I think, because that's what gets clicks. I hope that, and probably producers and like editors and that kind of stuff. I hope that eventually we find like a harmonious spot where people care more about like the more in-depth humanistic stuff rather than the stuff that trends the other way. Do you have any parting shots for the listener, Adam?
Parting shots. I'm impressed if people have made it this far to hear us riff about the morality of NBA media and things like that.
I'll tell you, I have conditioned at least a portion of this listener base to think that this is exactly how podcasts might go, and the retention rate, it's pretty good. So I think there'll
but
be people.
But I think one thing too is sometimes I think like one thing I saw that really stuck out to me this off season was with the departure of like Fred Van Vliet. He was a guy who was one of these stories that is like super interesting. Like I think it's like I don't know if you can rank all time NBA stories, but a guy who was undrafted, he gets NBA Finals MVP votes. Was big part of a championship team, made his way to an All Star game. Made two major contracts, and I think you would see people were saying like on his way out, people were saying like, oh, like thanks to Fred for his time here, his media members and fans, and people just found a need to be like, oh, why would you say that? What do you mean Fred was nice to the media? Why would you? Are you guys just like you guys are too nice to each other and you weren't critical enough of him and things like that? And I think it's just like it's weird to say that you can say, oh, Van Vliet had a bad game or had a bad stretch a few weeks, he wasn't shooting the ball well, but I think at the end of the day, you look at like a guy like Van Vliet in his time here, and it's okay to like say positive things about a player, even if the NBA is a complex sport, and sure, there'd be some games where you'd look and it'd be like, oh, Van Vliet's shooting 3 of 17, that's not going to help the team win tonight. But I think it's okay to understand that like just because you say nice things about a player, it doesn't mean that you're like immune to to say when they're not performing well, and that's like part of the reason why we have box scores, and part of the reason why it's important to contextualize what a player says after those types of games, and yeah, I think just like it's okay for like fans and media and players to just like be on good terms in some sense, and still recognize that, yeah, if the Raptors are doing well, then Toronto media markets are probably doing well, and if the Raptors aren't doing well, then less people are watching the games, and like it's okay to say that, like, you've been working with somebody in some capacity for some amount of time, and it's been a positive relationship for the most part. And I think it's just like, sometimes people just have this idea that it always has to be people pushing each other down, when like you realize that some of the best voices in Raptors media or NBA media are created because they built the platform through, whether it was the Raptors going through their championship run, or whether it was just covering any teams in big moments. Everybody kind of has their breakout moments, and it's okay for people to say like, oh, this was a nice person, this was a nice guy. And it doesn't always have to be a negative relationship between media, fans, and players.
I think people initially think that, like, and this I don't disagree with. If Darko happens to engage with my X's and O's like questions way better than Nick did, that is meaningful to me. But I also understand that people were like, keep asking Sam, like cheering me on when Nick would rebuff me. And I think like that's the natural, like, some people view it as media has to be inherently antagonistic to the players. Like that is their perception of the media. And if you're not inherently antagonistic, then you are complicit in what that player does, or you're doing work to absolve them of blame or anything like that. But I don't think it's that binary. I had in that media room one of the least substantial relationships with Fred of many, many people there. I didn't talk to him with the 905. It was my first year on the beat. And, like Lewis coming on the podcast and saying that he got to cover Fred with the 905 and like had good conversations and has covered him for years. That's important to him. Like he got to tell cool stories, all that kind of stuff. But even I, as somebody who has always been, I guess, like critical of Fred's game, never Fred the person, but critical of Fred's game. Even I found if I said anything good about Fred, despite never writing like a feature on him or never saying that I thought, he was fantastic or anything like that, that I would be lumped in with the media as like, why do you guys love Fred so much? All this kind of stuff. And so I don't think it's a personal thing. I think it's just a lack of like insight on that. Whoever is commenting on that, I think they're viewing the media as a whole, when in reality, as you said, like on a given night, there's 15 different pieces or something coming out. Um, Doug Smith and I write different things. Doug Smith and you write different things. Michael Grange and I get along really well. We talk about like lots of stuff, but we don't write similar stuff. Um, there's a lot of diversity in media, even in an approach to what they think the best way the Raptors should go forward is. As you know, it's a bunch of like basketball nerds having conversations about basketball in the media room. But yeah, there is a very, very healthy distaste for Toronto media right now in the fan base, which I find interesting. And well, I don't think I'll ever be able to fully understand. But yeah, especially since I just view them as like working class people. But hey, okay. Any final parting shots?
Yeah, well, just a final response to that. I think that it goes back to, it's a quote that you've heard from, like, Pascal Siakam, Masai Ujiri, Van Vliet again. They always kind of say, like, winning fixes everything in a sense. And I think
Sure.
when the Raptors are doing well, I think the media will be nicer to us. And I don't know at what point, or sorry, I mean, I think the fans will be nicer to the media, but I don't know at what point that's coming. I think people, anybody who was around for that 2019 era of teams realized how fun those teams were to cover, and how good the vibes were. And sometimes the vibes are a little bit off, but you hope that whatever comes forward with like this Raptors team in the next year, and however Darko's relationship with the fans forms, and what kind of questions he gets asked, and we'll see how that all filters out. But like, I think it's still just a blessing to be able to do this, even with all the the problems that come with it. I think it's a at the end of the day, everybody in media tends to really enjoy their job, and um, I hope that you and I can, and everybody else that works in basketball media in Canada can do their best to just kind of present, a great sport to whatever platform they're on.
And yeah, the most important thing isn't that we're well liked, it's that we do the best job to tell people's stories responsibly. That's like, and some of this is just like, it's we don't want to be have like negative responses to a bunch of the work we do. That of course is not super nice. I like when the Raptors are winning and people are much more receptive to my hyper specific explanations of why what the Raptors do works rather than the hyper specific explanations of what's going wrong. um, but the most important thing, our job as media, isn't to be like well liked. It's to tell truthful stories of what's happening for the people that we cover, and truthfully, given the stakes, to cover these people optimistically. I think that is what they deserve. Adam, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation with me. It's been an absolute blast.
Thanks so much for having me on, and I hope to do it again next off season when the world's in a different place.
Hell yeah. The yearly check-in on the media for us to navel gaze a little bit and
Oh yeah,
consider. Go
when
ahead.
Rogers and Bell, merge it or whatever they're going to do, or some massive media thing happens, and we realize that Raptors games are suddenly broadcast on Apple TV or something like that. We'll have another conversation about it a year from now.
Yep. Rapidly changing landscape. One that deserves attention, not just from us kind of talking about it off the cuff, but for people to consider intensely in boardrooms and all that kind of stuff. We'll see how it goes. Adam, thank you. Listener, thank you. And whether you got into this in the morning or at night, have a blessed day and goodbye.